The year was 1870, and the wind, it seemed, carried not just the scent of pine and damp earth across the vast Canadian wilderness, but also the whisper of 1,000 dreams. I was 10 then, old enough to understand the weight of my father's hopes, yet young enough to believe in the magic of his grand pronouncements. He called it Oakhaven, a name he spoke with the reverence of a preacher, a promised land nestled somewhere deep within the unforgiving embrace of British Columbia's interior. We had sold everything: the small, stubborn farm in Ontario, my mother's cherished heirloom locket, even my older sister Alara's pony, Spark, whose absence still pricked at my heart like a splinter. Father had heard tales, whispers really, of a new gold strike, a vein so rich it would make men kings. Not just gold, he'd insisted, but copper, silver, and timber beyond imagination. Oakhaven, he'd declared, wasn't just a mining camp. It was to be a city, a beacon of prosperity that would rise from the wilderness, a place where families like ours could finally plant roots deeper than a season's crop. Our journey had been long, stretching across weeks that blurred into an eternity of rattling wagons, dust-choked trails, and nights spent under a canvas of stars so bright they felt close enough to touch. My mother, bless her weary soul, tried to keep spirits high, singing old Scottish ballads in her soft voice, as Ilara, usually so spirited, watched the passing landscape with quiet apprehension. I, for my part, clung to Father's every word, imagining Oakhaven as a bustling place, full of general stores overflowing with candy, workshops clanging with the sound of blacksmiths, and perhaps even a schoolhouse where I could finally learn to read beyond the few dog-eared books Mother carried. He'd shown us a crude map drawn on a piece of parchment that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and ambition. On it, Oakhaven was a neat grid: Main Street, Prospectors Lane, River Road, all radiating from a central square where Father vowed a grand public hall would stand. He'd spoken of fertile land for farming, a river teeming with fish, and a climate mild enough for year-round living. It was a vision, he'd said, a chance to build something new, something lasting, a legacy for us all. The last leg of our journey was the hardest. The road, if one could even call it that, narrowed into a treacherous track, winding through dense, ancient forests where the trees stood so tall they seemed to scrape the very heavens. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest floor in an perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The wagon groaned and creaked, its wheels sinking into mud in places, forcing Father and I to jump down and push. Ilara and Mother huddled together under their blankets, their faces pale with exhaustion. Even the usually stoic oxen seemed weary, their breath pluming white in the crisp morning air. Days melted into nights, each one colder than the last, and the cheerful banter that had once filled our wagon had dwindled to terse instructions and the rhythmic creak of the wheels. Doubt, a thin, cold tendril, began to snake its way into my hopeful heart. Oakhaven felt less like a dream and more like a fable, a story told to eager children to keep them moving forward. Then, one afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, Father pointed. "There. Boys! There it is! Oakhaven!" he cried, his voice hoarse but brimming with renewed enthusiasm. I strained my neck, peering through the gaps in the trees. What I saw, however, was not the bustling town of my imagination. It was nothing. Or, rather, it was a stillness that spoke of abandonment, a silence far deeper than the wilderness around us. We emerged from the thick woods into a clearing, and the sight that greeted us was like a half-finished drawing, sketched out in haste and then forgotten. There were no grand buildings, no central square, no general store or clanging blacksmith. Instead, Scattered across the uneven ground were skeletal wooden frames, like ghosts of houses that had never been clothed in walls or roofs. Some had foundations laid, rough-hewn logs forming squares in the earth, already being reclaimed by moss and weeds. Others were just piles of lumber, stacked haphazardly, weathered gray by untold seasons of rain and sun. A few stood partially, erected bare beams reaching towards the sky like a desperate, unanswered prayer. The most substantial structure, visible even from a distance, was a large, unfinished building that Father later told us was meant to be the community hall. Its timber walls stood proud, but its roof was incomplete, gaping openings revealing the darkening sky. The ground was scarred with half-dug trenches and piles of excavated earth, evidence of work begun and abruptly halted. There were no other wagons, no smoke rising from chimneys, no distant sounds of axes or hammers. Just the sigh of the wind through the pines and the distant call of a lone bird. It was a town that had died before it lived, a dream stillborn. The silence was the loudest sound, amplifying the hollow ache in my stomach. Mother gasped softly, a hand flying to her mouth. Even Ilara, who had been quiet for days, let out a small, choked sound. Father, however, kept his gaze fixed ahead, his jaw set. He brought the oxen to a halt, the wagon wheels settling into the soft earth with a final, weary sigh. He jumped down, his boots crunching on fallen twigs, and walked slowly towards the nearest half-built structure. His shoulders slumped. The light was fading fast, and the unfinished frames cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch in the gathering gloom. It felt like standing in the ruins of a forgotten civilization, though no civilization had ever truly bloomed here. This was Oakhaven, the ghost town that died before it lived, and it was to be our new home. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way down my spine. The great adventure had begun, but not as we had imagined. It had begun in the quiet, desolate embrace of what was meant to be a vibrant new beginning, but was instead a testament to grand plans gone awry. The first night in Oakhaven was a silence so profound it felt like a presence pressing in on us from every side. Father, usually a man of decisive action, stood for a long time by the wagon, his shoulders slumped, gazing at the skeletal outlines of what was meant to be his grand city. Mother finally broke the spell, her voice softer than usual, but with a firmness that spoke of hidden strength. "Robert," she said, "the sun is almost gone. We need shelter, however temporary." Her words seemed to snap him out of his trance. He turned, his eyes, usually so bright with conviction, holding a flicker of something akin to despair. We chose the largest of the unfinished structures, the one Father had called the community hall. It had 3 walls mostly up, though the boards were rough and ill-fitted, letting the bitter wind whistle through the gaps. The 4th side was completely open, a gaping maw facing the encroaching darkness. There was no roof, only a skeletal framework of rafters reaching towards the darkening sky, like the ribs of some colossal long-dead beast. We quickly unloaded what we could from the wagon: blankets, our cooking pot, a small tent that was meant for an emergency, not our primary dwelling. Father and I worked together, using some of the scattered lumber to try and block off the open side, but the wood was heavy and our tools limited. It was a makeshift barrier at best, offering little protection from the biting cold that was already seeping into our bones. Mother, meanwhile, meticulously cleared a small patch of ground inside, spreading out our thickest canvas tarp as a floor. Ilara, unusually quiet, helped arrange the blankets, her small hands moving with a resigned efficiency. As darkness fully descended, the forest around us seemed to come alive with new sounds: the rustle of unseen creatures, the hoot of an owl, the unsettling groan of the ancient trees in the wind. The cold intensified, piercing through our layers of clothing. We huddled together on the canvas tarp, wrapped in every blanket we possessed. Father managed to get a small fire going in a cleared spot near one of the existing walls, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows that made the skeletal structure seem even more eerie. The smoke, with no chimney to escape through, billowed around us, stinging our eyes and catching in our throats. Mother warmed some leftover stew, its meager portion a stark reminder of our dwindling supplies. We ate in near silence, the metallic clatter of spoons against the pot sounding unnaturally loud in the vast quiet. Every so often, I'd glance at Father, whose face was illuminated by the firelight, lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. He looked older, tired, the vibrant spark that usually animated him dimmed by the harsh reality of Oakhaven. He kept, trying to reassure us, his voice a little too hearty. "A little discomfort, that's all. We'll have a proper roof over our heads by week's end, mark my words." But his words felt hollow, like the empty structure surrounding us. The night dragged on, interminable. Sleep was a restless, fitful thing, broken by shivers and the constant awareness of the vast, wild unknown just beyond our flimsy shelter. I remember listening to the rhythmic breathing of Mother and Alara, trying to discern if they were truly asleep, or just pretending. Each gust of wind seemed to bring with it the mournful sigh of a ghost. The moon, when it finally rose, cast long, spectral shadows through the unroofed hall, making the unfinished beams look like gallows. I kept my eyes tightly shut, trying to conjure the image of the bustling Oakhaven Father had painted, but all I could see was the chilling emptiness before me. Morning finally arrived, a gray, reluctant dawn that brought little warmth. My body ached from the cold and the unforgiving ground. The first thing Father did was survey our new home in the light of day. The scale of the abandoned work was even more apparent. The entire clearing was dotted with these spectral frames. Some had clearly been intended for homes, others for shops. There were even a few deeper excavations that looked like they might have been for a well or a privy. But everywhere, the story was the same. Work started, then abruptly ceased. Tools lay rusting where they had been dropped, planks of wood were scattered, piles of stone sat unused. It was as if everyone had vanished overnight, leaving their dreams unfinished, frozen in time. "What happened, Pa?" I finally asked, my voice small, in the vast quiet. He sighed, rubbing a hand across his beard. "I don't know, son. The letter I received said the gold strike was booming, that men were flocking here. It mentioned an early winter, perhaps, but this looks like everyone just upped and left." He walked around, kicking at a loose piece of lumber, his brow furrowed in thought. Maybe a new, richer strike was found elsewhere? Or disease? His voice trailed off, each suggestion sounding less convincing than the last. He looked like a general surveying a lost battle, trying to understand where it all went wrong. Mother, ever practical, turned her attention to making a proper breakfast over the still smoldering fire. "It doesn't matter why they left, Robert," she said, her voice steady. "What matters is what we do now. We need water, and we need to secure this place. We can't stay in an open-air shed for long." Her words, simple and direct, had a calming effect. Father nodded, his resolve slowly returning. "You're right, Sarah. We'll start by making this section livable. Then we find out where the water is, and then we dig." The last word was said with a grim determination, a hint of his old fire rekindled. He still believed, I realized, that this was his chance, his last great gamble. Ilara, having seemingly recovered from her initial shock, began to explore the perimeter of the half-finished hall, picking up stray pieces of wood, her gaze sharp. She pointed to a set of roughly stacked logs. "Father, these look newer. And there are some tools over there, too. Her observations spurred us into action. We spent the better part of the morning working, dragging fresh logs to reinforce our makeshift wall, trying to patch the wider gaps. The cold seeped into our clothes, making our fingers numb. But the physical labor was a welcome distraction from the oppressive silence and the nagging questions that swirled in my mind. Why were there no personal effects? No discarded boots? No broken shovels? No forgotten blankets? It was too clean, too empty for a place that had supposedly seen a rush of prospectors. It felt as if no one had ever truly lived here, only built the skeletons of their ambitions, and then simply vanished. The thought sent another shiver down my spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't just an abandoned town. It was a riddle wrapped in timber and silence. The days that followed were a blur of aching muscles and bone-deep cold. Our grand community hall was slowly, painstakingly transformed into a semblance of a home. Father, with my clumsy assistance, managed to haul enough timber to complete the fourth wall, albeit with gaping cracks that still invited the wind. A crude roof, made from overlapping planks salvaged from the countless abandoned piles, provided some shelter from the perpetually overcast sky, though the rain still found its way through in a fine, persistent drizzle. Mother and Elara worked tirelessly within, chinking the larger gaps with mud and moss, making a relatively drier corner where we could huddle at night. The fire, now contained within a makeshift stone hearth, became the heart of our meager existence, its warmth a constant. Desperate comfort against the encroaching chill. Finding water was our most immediate triumph. Father, after hours of searching along the dried stream beds marked on his original map, finally located a trickle emerging from a rocky outcrop just west of our camp. It was small but clear and cold, a precious lifeline in the desolate landscape. Hauling it back in our single wooden bucket became one of my daily chores, a task I undertook with a strange mixture of resentment and pride. Each trip was a journey through the silent, skeletal remains of Oakhaven, past the unfinished houses and the rusting tools, each one a stark reminder of the unknown fate of those who had come before us. Father, though outwardly focused on making our shelter habitable, was clearly consumed by the mystery of Oakhaven's abandonment. Every evening, after our meager supper, he would pore over his map, his finger tracing lines, muttering to himself. He'd spend hours during the day wandering the perimeter of the ghost town, inspecting every half-finished foundation, every discarded piece of equipment. He was looking for clues, for an explanation beyond a simple shift in gold prospects. "It's too sudden," he'd declare, his voice raspy with frustration. "Men don't just leave their livelihoods, their tools, their very houses in such a hurry. There's no sign of a struggle, no broken wagons on the road in. It's as if they simply vanished." His questions echoed in my own mind. The silence of Oakhaven was not the peaceful quiet of untouched nature. It was the oppressive stillness of something interrupted, something left unspoken. I found myself imagining the phantom inhabitants, a grumpy old prospector leaving his pickaxe mid-swing, a young family abandoning their partially built cabin, a store owner leaving his scales on the counter. Why? What could have driven them away so completely, so quickly? The wind, whistling through the gaps in the timber, sometimes sounded like voices, like whispered warnings that were just beyond my understanding. Elara, usually so resilient, grew quieter with each passing day. She avoided exploring the farthest reaches of the town, preferring to stay close to Mother, her eyes darting nervously into the shadows of the surrounding forest. One particularly gray afternoon, while Father was off attempting to set snares for small game, Mother asked me to gather some dry kindling from the abandoned lumber piles. "Only stay close, mind you," she cautioned, her gaze lingering on the dark tree line. I nodded, grabbing the empty sack, and set off towards a larger pile of timber about 50 yards from our haul. The wood was stacked haphazardly, overgrown, with moss in places, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp, decaying pine. As I rummaged, pulling out smaller, drier pieces from the bottom, my hand brushed against something hard and smooth, not wood. I pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover warped and stained with moisture. It looked like a journal, though its pages were swollen and brittle. My heart began to thump a little faster. This was different. This was personal. Unlike the abandoned tools or lumber, a journal spoke of a person, of thoughts and experiences. I carefully opened it. The ink had blurred in many places, making the script almost illegible, but one page, closer to the middle, was somewhat clearer, protected perhaps by a fold in the leather. I could just make out a date, October 24th, 1869, and then a few lines written hastily as if in fear. The fever spread rapidly. Coughing, chills, delirium, no one immune. Dr. McIntyre tried. Too many. They are leaving. Not enough coffins. The ground too hard. North. The mountains. Trying to escape. My eyes widened. Fever, delirium, not enough coffins. The words sent a cold dread through me, far worse than any ghost story. This wasn't about gold or failure. This was about sickness. Death. I closed the journal quickly, feeling a sudden chill despite the physical exertion. I looked around. The skeletal structures of Oakhaven now seemed less like abandoned dreams and more like monuments to a silent, unseen plague. Had the people not vanished, but simply died? Or fled in a panic, leaving their dying behind? The thought was terrifying. I rushed back to the hall, clutching the journal tightly. "Mother, look what I found!" I exclaimed, my voice a little breathless. She took the damp book from my trembling hands, her brow furrowing as she saw its condition. As she read the discernible lines, her face drained of color. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, her gaze meeting mine. "We need to show this to your father, immediately." Her voice was low, laced with a fear I rarely heard from her. When father returned, triumphantly holding a small, limp rabbit, mother immediately handed him the journal. He read the entry, his expression shifting from curiosity to grim understanding and finally to a profound sadness. He sat down heavily on a rough-hewn log, the rabbit forgotten beside him. The fire crackled, but the warmth seemed to drain from the air. "A plague," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's why they left. They didn't vanish. They fled or perished." The journal had given us an answer, but it was an answer that brought a new, far more insidious fear. The ghost town wasn't just empty. It was a grave, a silent testament to a forgotten epidemic. The very air around us, the dust on the ground, the wood of our shelter, could it still carry the blight? The silence of Oakhaven now spoke not of a riddle, but of a warning, and we, unknowingly, had walked right into its forgotten embrace. The setting sun cast long, sinister shadows across the unfinished timbers, and for the first time, I truly understood the full, chilling weight of the silence that enveloped us. We weren't just alone in the wilderness, we were alone with the ghosts of a forgotten tragedy. The journal lay between us, a small, damp harbinger of dread, its faded ink speaking a truth far more chilling than any ghost story. The rabbit father had snared, usually a cause for celebration, lay forgotten, its lifeless eyes staring into the deepening gloom. The fire, which moments before had been a source of comfort, now seemed to cast grotesque, dancing shadows that writhed with unseen threats. Mother was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "The fever. It explains everything. The abandonment, the lack of struggle. They didn't leave, Robert. They died, or fled in terror." Father's face, usually so animated with purpose, was a mask of grim understanding. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of deep distress. "My God," he murmured. "All this time I thought it was just ill fortune, bad timing, a poor investment." His eyes scanned our makeshift home, lingering on the rough timber walls, the very planks that might have been touched by the sick or the dying. A profound silence fell, heavier than the chill in the air. It wasn't just the cold now that made me shiver, but the insidious thought that this entire place, Oak Haven, the town of forgotten dreams, was steeped in the very thing that had emptied it. Every gust of wind through the gaps in our walls seemed to carry more than just cold air. It carried the breath of the past, the faint phantom coughs of those who had succumbed. Ilara, who had been listening with wide, terrified eyes, pulled her blanket tighter around her. Are we safe, Father?" she asked, her voice trembling. It was the question that hung unspoken in all our minds. Father hesitated, his gaze sweeping over each of us, a man suddenly confronted with the crushing weight of his decisions. "We are as safe as we can make ourselves, lass," he finally said, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual strength, though it was still rough at the edges. "The cold, the air, it will have scoured much of it away. We must be vigilant, yes, but we cannot abandon everything now. Not yet." His words, meant to reassure, also served as a stark reminder. We had nowhere else to go. Our wagon, our few possessions, our very lives were tied to this desolate spot. Retreat was not an option. We had burned our bridges in Ontario. Oak Haven, dead or alive, was our only hope. The revelation of the fever transformed our perception of Oak Haven. Every creak of the old timbers, every rustle in the surrounding undergrowth, now carried a sinister undertone. The abandoned tools, once merely curious relics, became unsettling mementos of lives abruptly extinguished. The half-built cabins seemed less like unfinished projects and more like open graves, waiting. I found myself scrutinizing the ground beneath my feet, half expecting to see telltale signs, faint indentations where someone might have collapsed. Mother became meticulous about boiling every drop of water we collected, a quiet ritual she performed with a grim determination. She made us wash our hands rigorously before every meal, rubbing them with sand and cold water until they were raw. Ilara, usually prone to youthful mischief, now clung close to Mother, her playful spirit replaced by a quiet apprehension. She no longer ventured far from the fire, her eyes constantly scanning the dark corners of our hall. Father, though deeply troubled, channeled his anxiety into relentless work. He seemed to believe that if he simply did enough, built enough, fortified enough, he could somehow ward off the unseen menace. He doubled his efforts to secure our shelter, hauling more lumber, patching every crack, and even attempting to fashion a rudimentary door from a salvaged wagon board. The cold and the looming threat of the fever only intensified his drive. He was a man fighting not just the elements, but an invisible enemy. "We must make this place our fortress," he'd declare, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. "Against man, against beast, against anything this wilderness throws at us." He never specifically mentioned the fever, but the unspoken fear hung heavy in the air. The immediate priority, beyond securing our dwelling, became food. The few snares Father had set yielded little, and our provisions were dwindling alarmingly. The irony was bitter. We were trapped in a potential death trap, yet our most pressing concern was the gnawing emptiness in our stomachs. Father, now with a new, somber resolve, decided we needed to venture further, cautiously, to scout for game trails and perhaps a larger water source. "We can't just huddle here and wait," he stated one morning, his gaze firm. "We need to know what lies beyond, and if there are safer places to hunt." That afternoon, Father, armed with his old hunting rifle, and I, clutching a small hatchet and a sack, set out. Mother made us promise to stay within shouting distance of each other and to return before dusk. The forest, once a place of wonder, now felt menacing. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth made my heart leap. We moved slowly, our eyes darting, not just for game, but for any sign of past human presence. An old trail, a discarded camp, anything that might speak of the fever's reach. We walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the untouched wilderness beyond Oakhaven's immediate vicinity. The terrain grew rougher, the trees denser. Then, as we rounded a particularly thick cluster of ancient pines, Father stopped abruptly, his hand raising to signal caution. Ahead of us, partially obscured by fallen leaves and encroaching undergrowth, was a small, crudely built mound of earth. It was too small, too regular, to be a natural feature. On top of it, sticking awkwardly out of the soil, was a small, weathered wooden cross, tilted at an odd angle. It was no larger than my hand. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a grave. And a child's grave, by the looks of the cross. A silent testament to the journal's words. Father walked slowly towards it, his expression unreadable. He knelt, brushing away some of the leaves. There were no names, no dates, just the rough-hewn wood. But leaning against the base of the cross, half buried in the soil, was a small porcelain doll. Its painted smile was faded, its blonde yarn hair tangled and matted, and one of its eyes was missing. It was a child's toy, left behind, a final, heartbreaking tribute. A cold wave washed over me. This was the true face of Oakhaven's abandonment. Not just dashed hopes, but stolen lives. The fever hadn't just made them flee, it had consumed them one by one, leaving behind these silent, unmarked burials in the depths of the forest. The doll, so innocent and fragile, spoke volumes more than the journal. It spoke of a desperate, hurried farewell, a family torn apart, a child lost to the merciless wilderness, and an unseen disease. Father stood up, his face pale. He looked out at the dense, silent forest, then back at the crude grave, and finally, at me. His usual determination was replaced by a profound weariness. "We have found our answer, son," he said, his voice flat. "This place, it is truly haunted, not by spirits, but by sorrow. We must decide, to stay or to risk everything to leave." The question hung in the chilling air, a heavy burden that felt too great for a 10-year-old boy to bear. Oakhaven, the bee, town that died before it lived, now held the very real threat of claiming us too. The small, crooked wooden cross and the porcelain doll, half buried in the leaf litter, branded themselves onto my memory. They were no longer just symbols of a forgotten tragedy. They were tangible proof, a cold, hard knot of fear that tightened in my chest. Father knelt by the grave for a long time, his shoulders hunched, his strong frame suddenly appearing diminished. The rifle, usually held with such assurance, lay forgotten beside him. His earlier words, "We have found our answer, son. This place, it is truly haunted, not by spirits, but by sorrow," echoed in the silent woods. I watched him, a 10-year-old trying to reconcile the tireless, hopeful man who had dragged us across a continent with this profoundly weary figure. The vast, indifferent forest seemed to close in around us, amplifying the crushing weight of the revelation. The walk back to our makeshift hall felt immeasurably longer than the journey out. Each step was heavy, weighted not just by the fear of the unseen fever, but by the deeper, more insidious dread of what this discovery meant for us. Oakhaven, which had been merely desolate, now felt cursed, every unfinished timber frame a monument to a life cut short, every abandoned tool a relic of a frantic flight. I kept my eyes fixed on Father's back, a small beacon in the oppressive gloom of the forest. He moved with a leaden gait, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if avoiding the spectral gazes of those we now knew lay beneath the silent earth. The little hatchet in my hand felt useless, a child's toy against an invisible enemy. When we finally emerged into the clearing, the sight of our crude shelter, though still incomplete, offered a small, fleeting comfort. Smoke curled lazily from the makeshift chimney, and a faint flicker of firelight promised warmth. Mother and Alara were waiting, their faces etched with worry. As soon as Father stepped into the hall, the words tumbled out of him, raw and heavy, like stones spilling from a sack. He described the grave, the tiny cross, and then, his voice catching, the doll. Mother listened, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes welling up. Alara, already sensing the gravity of the situation, began to weep softly, burying her face in Mother's skirt. The cheerful crackle of the fire seemed to mock the sudden, profound sorrow that filled our cramped space. "We cannot stay, Robert," Mother finally declared, her voice choked with emotion, but firm. "We cannot risk it. We have faced hardship before, but this is different. It's too dangerous. For the children. For all of us." She looked at him, her gaze pleading. "We must turn back. Head south towards the nearest settlement, however far it is. We can start anew somewhere safe." Father paced the small confines of the hall, his boots scuffing the dirt floor. He ran a hand through his hair repeatedly, a gesture of deep distress. "Turn back to what, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "We have nothing left. No farm, no money to buy another. We sold everything. This was our last chance, our entire investment. Even if we could make it back through those mountains, what would await us? Poverty? Debt? More struggle than we have known?" He gestured vaguely at the desolate clearing outside. "And how far would we even have to travel to find a safe place? Weeks? Months? Winter is fast approaching. We barely have enough provisions for a few more days, let alone a journey of unknown length." His words were brutal in their honesty, a stark portrayal of our predicament. We were trapped. The wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, unforgiving and untamed. The vision of a bustling town had been shattered, replaced by the chilling reality of a forgotten plague, but the geographic trap remained. There was no easy escape. He finally stopped pacing, looking at Mother, then at Alara, and finally, his gaze resting on me. His eyes, usually so filled with dreams and ambition, now held a raw, desperate resolve. "We stay," he announced, the words heavy with resignation and grim determination. "For now we stay. We are already here. We have put too much into this to simply abandon it without a fight. We will take every precaution. We will boil all our water, wash everything, keep the fire blazing. We will live carefully day by day, and we will find out if this land truly holds what I was promised. If there is still gold, copper, timber to be had, we will earn our way out of this, not run from it." His voice had hardened, the trace of despair replaced by a fierce, almost desperate conviction. He was clinging to the last shred of his dream, reshaping it not as a grand vision of a city, but as a desperate gamble for survival and a path to escape the very place he had led us to. It was a terrifying decision, yet in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, it felt like the only one possible. The alternative, a journey into the unknown with dwindling supplies and no destination, seemed almost as perilous as staying put. From that day forward, our lives in Oak Haven became a constant, vigilant dance with fear. Every ache, every cough, every slight shiver was scrutinized, held up to the chilling mirror of the journal's words. Mother became a sentinel, her eyes constantly scanning our surroundings, her movements precise and cautious. She ensured the fire never died, believing its heat would purify the air. She made us wear our warmest clothes even inside, convinced that cold would make us vulnerable. Our meager meals, now supplemented by the occasional small game father managed to snare, were eaten in a silence heavier than before, each bite a conscious act of survival. My own childhood innocence, once so robust, began to fray at the edges. The woods, which I once dreamt of exploring, now seemed full of hidden menace. The half-built structures that had initially sparked my curiosity now stood as ghostly reminders of the unseen enemy. I found myself listening intently to the wind, half expecting to hear the distant phantom coughs of those who had succumbed. The constant quiet of Oakhaven, broken only by the crackle of our fire or the distant cry of a hawk, became a living, breathing thing, a vast, silent presence that watched our every move. I missed the sound of other people, the distant murmur of voices, the laughter of children. We were utterly, completely alone, surrounded not by neighbors but by graves, seen and unseen. One evening, as dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, I went out to gather more firewood from a pile closer to the edge of the clearing. The air was still and strangely heavy. As I bent down to pick up a fallen branch, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a shallow, rasping breath. It seemed to come from one of the half-dug foundations nearby, a dark, rectangular hole in the earth. I froze, my heart thumping against my ribs. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing more, just the sigh of the wind through the pines. My mind, already primed for fear, conjured images of the sick, left behind, abandoned to their fate. I snatched up what wood I could carry and sprinted back to the hall, not daring to look back. The sounds of Oakhaven, the town that died before it lived, were beginning to speak to me, and they were not comforting whispers, but chilling echoes of a forgotten agony. The days might have grown colder, but the fear within us burned hotter than ever.